Alright, let's get to the title of the video and then we'll get started. Gonna chop up some good game. Did Jesus exist? Alrighty. Alright, so the title of this video today is Did Jesus exist? I think this is a great question. I think that this is going to be a quick little video to kind of pound, it's a little bit of information down into your heads. You understand? So you can share this with the fam. You understand what I'm saying? And, this could be a good video for people who may have questions. So, again, did Jesus exist? Did this man, who is probably the most important man in Western civilization, I would say, did he actually exist? I would say no, he did not exist. Sure, how could you say something like that? The Bible is the infallible, inerrant truth, and it clearly states that Jesus exists, and we have Christianity. How can you say such things? Well, Christianity is a fairly new religion in the history of the world. Let's point that out. Number two, this is probably the most obvious. There is no archaeological evidence to support a Jesus existing. Period. So that's another noise killing argument. There's no archaeological evidence. There's no bones. There's no any of that to basically point out this man existing. And anyone that tells you that it's not important is a goddamn fool, because Rome, Greece, and all the other different civilizations, they made sure to point out who was important in their history. And clearly this man was not important by anybody to sit here and say, let's make sure that he's written down into history until years later, but I'll get into that later on. Secondly, the Bible is not a historic book. I always point this out to people. Don't use the Bible as a historic book. It may have some historic people here and there. It may talk about some little pinches of real history here and there, but it's not a historical book. Period, point blank. And let's go even more so into the Gospels, because the Gospels are supposedly these eyewitness accounts of Jesus. We don't know who Mark was. Mark is the oldest Gospel. Even though the Bible goes Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the correct order would be Mark first. Mark is the oldest Gospel. Now, another sad thing I need to point out is that me not being a Bible believer, I find myself knowing more about the Bible than people who are Bible believers. Which is kind of crazy that someone who is not a fundamentalist Christian or whatever the case is knows more about a book than a believer in the book. Like, come on, like that'd be like me, somebody knowing more about this book I'm going to be using as my source, nailed, than I do, and I have the book, and come on, it makes no sense. Christianity is the only religion where common sense somewhat goes out of the window. But nonetheless, Mark is our oldest gospel. All of the Gospels that we have are copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. We don't have an original Mark. We don't have an original Matthew. We don't have an original John. We have copies of copies of copies, and with these copies are mistakes. Now, the oldest Gospel goes back to around like 150 BCE. When was Jesus supposedly living? Damn near 150 years before then. So that kills the whole, we have eyewitness accounts of Jesus Christ. Not to mention, we have no proof of a Mark existing. We have no proof of a Matthew existing. None of these people are proven people to have existed. We just have their names on the book that says Mark wrote it, but we don't know if Mark actually lived to write it, if you understand what I'm saying. So this is just a fact. Like, any serious scholar would tell you this straight up. So a lot of this stuff kind of kills the argument itself, but there's a whole lot more information I'm going to pile into this video to, more so information to give to others. So people, because some people do know this information, I'm saying, let's just point that out. Some Bible believers agree with me and know exactly what I'm saying. They just still choose to believe Christianity because there are other people that that are usually sourced when trying to prove the religion. So there are a number of people who lived around the so-called time of Jesus that should have mentioned him, but do not mention him. There are I hear this argument all the time. The people back then were illiterate. They couldn't read. They couldn't write. So why wouldn't they write it down? And I'm thinking in my head, so you mean to sit here and tell me that the Roman Empire at that time, which pretty much was the superpower of that area at that time, they wrote about poop, they wrote about gravestones, they wrote about their wars with Greece, they wrote about all of these different things, but didn't choose to write about a man that walked on water, a man that fed thousands with 2 fish and a loaf of bread, a man that basically shook the entire world, basically in front of them. You mean to say and tell me nobody wrote about this man? And then he rose from the dead and then ascended into heaven. You mean to sit here and tell me that nobody decided to write about this dude? Nobody. And they literally were forced this down people. They were illiterate. So they didn't know how to write. That's bullshit. We have writings from Roman historians and Jewish historians as well, and Greek historians from the time that Jesus was supposedly living. And I'm going to cite some of them in this video, so that will kill that whole they were illiterate argument, because there's no reason why a man that turns water into wine should not be written about. Come on, today we write about stuff that's not even that's relevant in the grand scheme of humanity. We documented. So how could this man who did miracles not be written about by people during his time frame? So let's go into some of the people that are usually mentioned when we talk about Jesus Christ. So we're gonna first start off with the obvious one. May not be obvious to some, but obvious to others. Flavius Josephus. We're gonna talk about. These are just some names. I'm not gonna talk about all of them, of course. I don't want this to be a super long video. But Tacitus, he's a Roman historian. Thallus, he's a Roman historian. Finley the Younger. Let's get to some. Excuse me. Some. Excuse my bad. Some Jewish historians. Let me get to some of them right quick. So let's first start off with Cincia the Younger. And I'm gonna spell the name for everyone, so basically they can look it up. How you spell it is Seneca the Younger. He lived around 3 BC and he lived to 365. Not 365. He lived to 65 AD. He was a philosopher, a writer, a statesman, and a de facto ruler of the empire for many years. Also, this book is, again, nailed 10 Christian myths that prove that basically Jesus never existed at all. I'm on page 34. If you want to get the book, I recommend everybody get it. But let's continue. First, though, regarded as the greatest Roman writer on ethics, again, writer, he had nothing to say arguably about the biggest ethical shakeup of his time. Second, in his book, I can't pronounce the name of the book, he records eclipses and other unusual natural phenomena, but makes no mention of the miraculous star of Bethlehem and the multiple earthquakes of Jerusalem after his death, or worldwide. He doesn't make a mention of the darkness after the crucifixion that he would have witnessed. So this is a man who should have written about Jesus. That's not written about Jesus, because clearly he was a man in power. He can write and etc. Now, if someone wants to sit here and say, well, maybe the Romans didn't want to write about him because they were, embarrassed about, that's bullshit. To sit here and say that they were embarrassed, it's some bullshit, because if we're going to go according to the Bible, the Bible knew that a Messiah was coming. If we're going to go based off of that, they knew a Messiah was coming. They just didn't like Jesus. So the simple fact of the matter that after the fact, they knew this man was the Son of Man. I'm going according to the Bible now. They didn't write about him. It's some bullshit to sit here and say that they were embarrassed, because they would have written about him after the fact. Maybe not before, but after the fact, like immediately, they should have wrote about him. But he didn't. He had every opportunity to, but did not. Let's go to another one. This is another Roman historian. Gallio died 65 CE. His name is spelled again Gallio. Gallio. I maybe not be saying that right, but who gives a fuck? He is compounded by the fact that his older brother was Junius Annaeus Gallio, who actually appears in the Bible. According to the author of the Book of Acts 18:12 through 17, Galileo was a magistrate who heard Paul's case and threw it out. If this is true, it is curious that Galileo never seems to have told his older brother about the amazing Jesus character that everyone was so excited about. Again, another guy who should have written about him or should have told somebody about him does not mention this man. Let's get to some Jews. Because, let's get off. We could talk about the Romans being whatever, but let's get to some goddamn Jews. So, Jewish historian Justus of Tiberias was a native of Tiberias of Galilee, not far from Jesus' hometown, was a personal secretary to King Herod, and even wrote about the kingdom of Judah covering the entire time when Jesus lived. And it is very interesting that he says nothing about Jesus. Another man that didn't say anything about Jesus. Nicholas of Damascus lived in the late first century CE. Was among many I can't talk right now. Was among many other things tutor of Cleopatra. So again, let's throw that whole illiterate thing out of there. If you know who Cleopatra was, he was the tutor of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, and was a personal advisor of King Herod the Great. Nicholas wrote a book, wrote a history in one. I'm talking so fast right now. Nicholas wrote a world history in 144 books up until the end of Herod's reign, relying heavily on Herod's personal memoirs, of course, his own first-hand knowledge of basically what was going on. This man here should have mentioned Jesus, and clearly never single does. He would have been an eyewitness to the wise men that came into the court. He does not mention Jesus at all. Let's go to another one. Philo, and I kind of paraphrase that because there was a lot more in there, but he doesn't mention him. Philo of Alexandria. Now, people may mention him. He was a writer, political commentator, and an esteemed Jewish statesman. So let's throw that whole illiterate thing out the window. Not everybody back then was illiterate. Philo, above all, the greatest Jewish philosopher of the Greek and Roman world. He fused Jewish and Greek thought to create Hellenistic Judaism. Philo was around. Philo was one of the most prolific writers of the ancient world. Around a third of his books still have basically survived, so we still have his writings. Not just his extensive philosophical treatise on Judaism, but also his commentaries on politics, and even wrote about the events that was going on with the Jews. He was certainly interested in fringe religions and was not afraid to talk about them. He wrote a great deal on other Jewish sects at the time, such as the Essenes and I can't pronounce his other words, but nonetheless, he gets to the point. He didn't write anything about Jesus. So, bottom line is, these are some great men that we have writings from, that are documented, that we have coinage of, and etc. No mention of Jesus. There are more than just him. There's Marcus Cornelius Fonto. There is Maximus of Tyre. There's Athenaeus of... Athenaeus, I don't know how to fucking say where he's from, because they always say where they're from back then. I find it to be cool. It'd be like saying Trey of Atlanta. But nonetheless, none of these dudes wrote about Jesus. None of them. So I just always find that to be the most craziest thing in the world, that people like to mention, well, there are all these that were illiterate. Like, none of these people mention Jesus. And I just really find it to be crazy that none of these people mention Jesus. Now, the obvious one that most people go to, outside of Philo, because people do mention, I heard some people mention Philo, would be Josephus. That is Titus Flavius Josephus, for those who want to know his full name. He got that name basically from Rome. Now, he is known for writing his book, The Antiquity of the Jews, and basically wrote about the Jewish-Roman War and etc. And what people like David Fitzgerald and other different authors would say is that this man basically was a traitor of the Jews for Rome. He turned his back on the Jews and etc. and became basically a power figure for Rome. If you understand what I'm saying, because That's just simply put what history shows. It's not me really, I'm kind of paraphrasing a little bit because I really don't really want to go into depth inside this book or any of these other ones. But nonetheless, he was a traitor for the Jews. Now, people like to cite him as being someone who is a credible source for saying that Jesus existed. Well, for one, I do have that to write some down before I got here. Flavius Josephus, he a lot of times cites Aristobulus, who is pseudo in his own works about the history of the Jews, and then he also cites pseudo Hecataeus. So the whole history of Jews that he gives is pseudo essentially, and nonetheless, this man here saying that he wrote about Jesus. First of all, he lived after Jesus. Let's just get that out the way right now. Let me go inside of this book and actually go to what they actually talk about when it comes down to goddamn. Because I mean, even though I could, it's not really that big of a deal if I don't. But let me see if I can find where he talks about Josephus in his damn book. Because I mean, he talks about Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch. What the fuck is this Josephus part at? Because he actually has one here just talking about Josephus in itself. James Eusebius. Alright, here it is right here. The first so-called Testimonium Flavium, a snippet that interrupts an otherwise gloomy chapter to bring us the brief glowing summary of Jesus' miraculous character. Now there was about this time Jesus a wise man. It was a lawful to call him a man. He was an doer of wonders, wonderful works, a teacher of such men, and received the truth pleasure. He drew over him both many of the Jews and of Gentiles. Now, he basically cites that, from I think Antiquity of the Jews, book 18, chapter 3. But then he goes into his own soliloquy about basically, but is it real? The passage is too blatant, is so bluntly counterfeit. He called the passage counterfeit that no historian today denies that is a later forgery. That I'm sorry, oh my bad. The way I'm laughing because if you ever hear David Fitzgerald talk, and then you read his book, you hear his voice when he talks. So that's why I'm laughing. But he has a couple videos on YouTube. I recommend, if you don't want to get the book, which I recommend doing, go look at his videos. David Fitzgerald, he's a great orator. He has a great voice. Check him out. Let me get back to this. Basically said it's a forgery. The only debate is over how much of it is a forgery. Still, wishful apologists try to argue that Josephus really did mention Jesus, and over-enthusiastic scribes merely embellish his account, but even try to reconstruct the original testimonium. So, I mean, he has a whole entire lot more on Josephus in itself. And as I said again, Josephus is not a credible source because he uses pseudo-Hecataeus, and he cites Aristobulus. And the only people that, and this is kind of not talking about the Jesus thing per se, but we're talking about Jewish history, the only people that people should cite, and even though he is pseudo, but they only should cite, if they don't cite these four people, don't listen to what they have to say. First, I'm going to start off with the people who are credible. Hecataeus of Abdera, they need to cite him. They need to cite Diodorus Siculus. They need to cite, if you want to have a conversation, they need to cite, of course, Josephus, and they need to cite Aristobulus. If they don't cite any of these four dudes, forget about it. And two of them are pseudo. The reason why, like I said, became Aristobulus and what his name is, so Josephus are pseudo, is because there's nothing to back up what they're saying. Like David Fitzgerald says, a lot of this stuff is forgeries later on down the line to basically promote, I guess you could say, propaganda to a certain degree. And the reason why I say you have to source Hecataeus and Diodorus Siculus is because Diodorus, for one, he cites Hecataeus of Abdera in his writings. He lived a little bit. He died. He lived a little bit before Jesus, but nonetheless, he's a essentially a Greek historian that most people cite when it comes down to speaking on things such as biblical history, not biblical history, Jewish history, Greek history, because like I said, he cites Hecataeus of Abdera, who lived like 400 years before him, and Hecataeus of Abdera lived around the time when the Persians conquered the Egyptians, and he would have also seen when the basically when he would have seen the Jews. Basically, he wrote a book called Kreostos Gamma Sigma, and it's say it one more time, Kreostos Gamma Sigma, and this book is basically about his journey around the world. And he never ever says he runs into any Jews. In fact, if you want me to be honest with you, the only time he even mentions something lightly of a Jews is when he talks about the Egyptians, and we know that's not the biblical account at all. And to get into a whole another video, Hecataeus of Abdera, his mentions of Moses is not the mention of Moses that you're used to seeing or hearing about in the Bible. It's a completely different story. So again, these are people that they have to source. I always tell people, if they're not citing the Diodorus or Hecataeus of Abdera, I really don't want to talk to them. But if they cite Josephus, we could talk because we can build dialogue, and I can explain to them why his work may be pseudo. But nonetheless, there is no historical evidence of a Jesus Christ. Now, one thing I also do tell people is this here, is that Jesus Christ is not the only crucified Savior in history. I don't know if you can see my book in the back. I got Sons of God, and I have the world's 16 crucified saviors, and both of those books do a phenomenal job of pointing out different crucified saviors, such as Osiris of Egypt, or Asar of Kemet. That's more correct. Krishna of India, Buddha Siddhartha, Dionysus. These are different deities that from different I don't even like using the word religion, but spiritual sects during different times that were so-called crucified deities that died and rose again, born December 25th, did miraculous things, traveled with 12 disciples, etc., etc. The same thing, the same attributes that Jesus is given. These same people are given those exact same attributes, is what I'm basically trying to convey here. That he's just the one that's so-called stuck to a certain degree, because, I mean, let's just be real here. And this goes back to my previous video about monotheism. Now, according to my research, the father of monotheism is Akhenaten of Egypt, where it says we all stem from the Aten, or from the sun. Now, a more newer version of monotheism comes from Plato. And I probably should do a video on that Plato on the creation of the Hebrew Bible book. But basically what he says is that there should be a set of divine laws that rule a people, and that's how you get basically people to control the people, essentially. Have divine laws, because what's his name? Plato was essentially a monotheist. He didn't believe in all the Zeus and Pantheon, etc. He's a monotheist. And he kind of was an atheist, if you want to be honest, according to his day, though, atheists believe in the lack of God. He kind of was an atheist to a certain degree, but I won't call him an atheist. I will call him a monotheist. That's essentially what he was. And him and a bunch of other people said that we need to get everybody on the same page, have a set of divine laws, and we all stem from this one being. And basically his plan basically worked. And that's where we are here today, because everything from in everything Western wise is monotheist. And I always tell people that everything Bible came from polytheistic, because that's just what it was back then. Like, polytheism is, and it's not necessarily really even polytheism to a certain degree, because the whole thing of polytheism, I probably should have pointed this out in the other video, is that you just give attributes of nature to, you give it just to a deity. That's all it is because realistically speaking, let's just look at what the nigga name is. Let's just look at Ra from Ra from Egypt, or from Kemet. You know, he's a sun god. Like, that's all he is. Horus. He just basically represents, or Horus, or Horus. That's all he pretty much just represents is, you know, he's another sun deity to a certain degree, but he just basically is the sun in the calendar, essentially. That's Zeus, god of lightning, as I should say. I forgot what his name is in Greek mythology. Apollo, he was the god of the sun. Like they just attributed different attributes to different gods. That's all it was. It wasn't saying that, you know, I mean, that's just really all it is. And then when you look at, I think it's Noon. You know, I could be wrong about this, so somebody just correct me if I'm wrong. Noon, or Nut would be like the big god of the Egyptian pantheon, and I think it is, what's her name? I forgot what her name, but Greek mythology has its own female, this like the big boss of because I think it's the mother of Kronos. I can't remember the name because there's a lot of this. I'm kind of staring off, whatever the case is, but nonetheless, polytheism is not that bad when you think about it. You need air, you need water, so praying to Poseidon for good travels when you're on the water is not that bad, because when you get on a boat, you hope that it does not, you have safe travels. You know, when you go in the air and you fly, like, you hope that, you don't have bad storms or turbulence, so you would pray to Zeus or whatever the case is, that you would have. I mean, it's common. It's not that bad when you think about it. But, when, people are trained to believe, because the Bible says, have no other gods besides me, it kind of like when you're trained to look at it in a negative way, you will look at it in a negative way. But when you just think about it, it's really not that bad, because we do the same thing today. We just pray just to one God. Essentially, we just give him credit for all the attributes, and all they did back then was just give different sects of nature the credit for what it did. Like, but nonetheless, that's a different. I want to start somewhere else, but nonetheless, Jesus didn't exist. There is no archaeological evidence to support him existing. The people that should have written about him did not write about him, and the people that did write about him are later after the fact. Because I didn't even talk about the Council of Nicaea, I didn't talk about Eusebius, I didn't talk about Constantine, I didn't talk about any of these guys. None of them. I didn't even get there. But nonetheless, Jesus didn't exist. And, people need him as exist. I understand that. So I try not to come off as an asshole a lot of times when talking about this, because, I understand, like, people need this guy because he's the reason why people do what they do, why they have hope. He's everything that, he's everything in today's society. Like, because people say he died and rose for our sins. And I had a conversation with a brother about this, it kind of was, because a lot of Christians like to sit here and say that, well, I'm not calling him a Christian, and I won't say who it is, but a lot of people like to say that, well, Jesus knows everything that's going to happen, and he knows what's going to happen before it happens. And I just asked him, I said, well, why the fuck does he test you then? Because he was saying that he's been through stuff in his life, and my goddamn bird's saying pretty bird right now. But nonetheless, excuse me, people like to sit here and say that, well, God likes to test me, or whatever the case is. And I'm like, well, if God knows everything and knows what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, how you're going to do it, why the fuck would he test you? Like, at that point, that's playing games to me. Because if you know what I'm going to do and how I'm going to react, why do you need to see what I'm going to do? Why you test me? You know my heart. You know how I get down. You know what's really going on in here. And if that's the case too, then what's the point of having a heaven and hell then, and having us live and go through life then? So that we just, because the whole concept of him knowing everything is that there's this whole divine plan and my goddamn birds gonna start snapping when I get to this point, whatever the case is. But you get the point. It's almost as if God is playing games to a certain degree, and we're just all in this puppet show. I'm going according to the Bible, because this is what the Bible says. But then I also told him that I also asked, does he know that God can control man's heart? Because I brought up how God basically hardened Pharaoh's heart in Egypt when he was finna let the Egyptians go. And I'm like, well, he did harden his heart. So that's another example of him playing games with people. Because why put them in that, let them be in that situation in the first place? Then when they are about to get out, you decide to prolong their exodus. Common sense would say playing games. So, like I said, and these niggas seem to go based off when I talk. But that's just, it's common sense when you think about it, man. Like, come on. But nonetheless, like I said, man, Jesus didn't exist. I don't mean to bust anybody's bubble. He just didn't exist, man. Like, period, point blank. It's just, it is what it is. But I'm finna get up out of here. I didn't want this video to be too long, but peace. That's all there is to it.